So I sent out an email before class just about if you want to try coding along in class today. This is the repository, the sort of the starting place for what we're going to be working on today. It is a Rails application that already has some models, some associations, and a seed script set up. And then the idea is that we're going to, and it also has a rough API, a rough JSON API already built for us by way of scaffolding, but we're going to enhance that API to make it a little bit better. And so I've got this project loaded up in right over here inside of VS Code. And if we do a quick tour of the project, maybe I will start in the database folder. In the database folder, I put a schema diagram. Hopefully this is readable, but I'll walk through it. The idea here is that we have a application for listing or storing information about restaurants. Restaurants have many dishes, and those dishes are unique to that restaurant. So a dish that is at a particular restaurant is not served at other restaurants. So there's not a many-to-many association between restaurants and dishes. There is a one-to-many association between restaurants and dishes. A restaurant also has a name and a description associated with it. A dish has a name associated with it and a foreign key back to the restaurant. That's the one-to-many association. And then for a dish, we have a many-to-many association between two other tables here. We have an ingredients table and a measurements table. In the measurements table are units of measurement. And so a unit of measurement might be like a milligram or a milliliter or a liter. So it's a unit of measurement. And then the ingredient is just going to be the name of an ingredient. And then paired together, those are going to be measured ingredients. So if the ingredient was olive oil in the ingredients table, and you needed like 400 milliliters of olive oil, you would have in this measured ingredients table an amount of 400. You would link by way of a foreign key to milliliters in the measurements table. You would link by way of another foreign key to olive oil in the ingredients table. And then you would link back to the dish in which 400 milliliters of olive oil were required. And so this measured ingredients table actually has 3 foreign keys in it. The dish that this measured ingredient is being used in, the ingredient itself, the measurement itself, and then the amount is stored right on that table. This might make a little bit more sense if we hop into the seed script. And I will just pause for 1 second because I saw a few other questions pop up down below. One question was, if we're not doing a strict e-commerce site, can we get marks that are similar but not 100% accurate? Yes, try not to go too far outside, but I can definitely, we can definitely during our first sort of in-person marking session, or even just to confirm this ahead of time, we can go over some sort of equivalencies. So if you say, well, I'm not going to be able to do this thing 100%, but is this other thing equivalent? We can definitely set that up. And so yeah, an example, a pizza delivery app that doesn't have a list of products but has a list of ingredients, that's totally fine. Okay, so here's the seed script that seeds the database that I just went over. I do use Faker for this, but for some things I just sort of hard coded in. So the measurements I spoke of earlier, I just have an array of measurements, milliliter, liter, milligram, and gram. That's just in an array, and that's going to be put into the measurements table. And then I have some constants for like how many of these various things are being created. There's a couple custom methods here that I'll talk about in a moment. Maybe I'll make some of this a little bit bigger. Here I am looping through that array of measurements and creating items in the measurement with the measurement model into the measurements table, and then I go and fetch them all for later use. So I have this measurements array that's just all of the measurements. I loop number of ingredients times. I think it's 100 that I've chosen for the number of ingredients, and I create an ingredient for each of those in the ingredient table using Faker. And then most of the work here is going to happen inside of this number of restaurants loop. Inside of number of restaurants, I create a restaurant with a Faker generated unique name and description. That gives me a restaurant object. And then for number of dishes per restaurant, I create a dish using the restaurant's dishes association. And so if we look at the models, a restaurant has many dishes. And so I can go to a restaurant object dot dishes to create associated dishes, and it will make that association for us by way of the foreign key. So that's what's happening here. Restaurant, using this restaurant from line 33 to create a dish, and I'm using Faker to create the unique dish name. Then based on the name of the dish, I'm going to the Unsplash API and I'm attaching an image to the dish. And so if we looked at the dish model, we can see it has one attached image. So I'm using active storage for that. So I attach that image, and then I'm going to get some ingredients. And I have a little method called sample model, and it takes in the name of a model and how many things we want, and it's going to return sort of a randomized collection of ingredients. And if you're interested in how that works, you can go look at how I implemented sample model, but just know that it's going to get grabbed from the ingredients table, a random set of ingredients of this quantity. And then for each of those ingredients, I'm going to create measured ingredients. So remember, that's this idea of this join table being a way to link dishes to particular ingredients of a particular amount with a particular measurement. And so here I am looping over the ingredients, and for the dish, creating measured ingredients of a random amount using the ingredient that's being looped over, and then going to my measurements that I created up here and just sampling or picking a random measurement. And then I just have some sanity checks down below. I made a little method called creation check that takes in the name of a model and takes in the expected number of objects of that type that I am expecting to be made, and it just compares with what's actually in the table. And so it's going to tell me success or failure for all of those. And I just wanted those as I was developing this seed script, just to make sure there weren't any cases when you know, maybe I was hitting a validation error and it was silently failing and not creating all of the restaurants or ingredients or dishes, etc. And yeah, so that works well. If you look up at the top of the seed script, you'll see that it's missing the area that in previous seed scripts I always went and like deleted all of the existing tables, and I would always run into issues like deleting them in the wrong order and whatnot. Rails is so featureful that I'm still learning all these years later new features in Rails. And one of the features that I learned this time around was Rails DB reset. And what Rails DB reset does, I can actually just run it here. It goes and it drops all of your database tables, and then it immediately calls the seed script. And so here it dropped the databases, it drops both the development and the test database. It recreates those files, and then it runs the seed script and it rebuilds the seeds. And so that's quite nice. One of the reasons I like that is that the primary keys, the auto incrementing primary keys, always start back at 1 that way. Not that we want to sort of rely on that, but it is sort of nice and it looks cleaner to have our primary keys starting back at 1. If you just constantly go to the model and you say destroy all, of course primary keys aren't reused, so every time you run the seed script, you're ending up with larger and larger primary keys. So it's running right now, it's creating all the things. Maybe I shouldn't have run it. It takes a bit of a time. Specifically, the thing that's slowing it down the most is the fact that it has to visit the Unsplash API for every dish that's being created. And how many dishes are there? Well, there are dishes per restaurant. And so there are 5 dishes per restaurant. There are 10 restaurants. So we are creating 50 dishes. So we have to visit that API 50 times. And for each time, we actually download the image and attach it to the dish model. Things ran, everything created as expected. I got 4 measurements, 10 restaurants, 100 ingredients to choose from, 50 dishes, and 300 measured ingredients. Let's take a look at what this looks like from the local host. So I'm running the server. If I'm on dishes/dishes right now, if I just went to the root, there's nothing. It's just the welcome to Rails page. I know things are operating. If I go to /restaurants, I'll see my list of restaurants and their descriptions. And what you can see here is that I have scaffolded this application. And I scaffolded it because, not because I actually wanted to use the scaffolded Crud, but because when you scaffold an application, not only do you get web-based scaffolded Crud, you also get API-based scaffolded Crud. And so you're going to have the ability with JSON formatted data and specific URLs to interact with all of our data sets as an API. What I mean by that is if I go and add a .json to the end of this URL, I will get back a JSON. Make this a little bit smaller here and easier to deal with. So here's a JSON representation of the restaurants. You can see if I went to raw data, I'm getting an array back. It's a square brace at the outermost level, and it's an array of JSON objects, right? Where each object has an ID, a name, a description, a created at, an updated at, and for discoverability, a URL. And so this is a URL to the JSON representation of just this restaurant itself. So if I clicked on that, there's just the Golden Spoon restaurant as opposed to all of the restaurants. So that sort of quote unquote comes for free when we do scaffolding. Same thing goes for dishes here. These are my dishes. There's a lovely Peking duck about to be cooked, I guess. And if I added .json to the end of that, we get a JSON representation of that. So the idea here is I'm going to remove all of the HTML views and all of the HTML routes and just leave the JSON ones in place. And then I'm going to enhance the JSON ones to provide a little bit more information. Because right now, for example, with the dish, yes, we can see that this dish belongs to restaurant ID 1. And then how do we get any information off or about restaurant ID number 1? The best APIs are discoverable APIs, meaning that when you mention a thing like an association, it might be nice to provide a link to that thing, right? So when we have an associated restaurant for a dish, it might be nice to provide the endpoint that one could hit if they wanted more information about the restaurant, or it might even be nice in the payload itself to include the link and the restaurant's name, like a little bit of information about that association. Dishes also have ingredients by way of measured ingredients. We're going to enhance this response to actually provide a list of ingredients with every dish in our JSON payload. Okay, so that's the high-level overview of the model or set of models that we're working with here. And so that's this here, this idea of restaurants that have many dishes, dishes that have a many-to-many association through measured ingredients to ingredients and their measurements. Is there any initial questions about the setup here, sort of the set of models, the set of associations, or the initial JSON API that's already set up? the way this was all built, again, was by scaffolding. And so what I mean by that is, closing down that schema here, when I built these things, for example, the dish there, I did a Rails generate scaffold. And then I said, well, a dish has a name that is a string, and then there is a restaurant that it references. And what that built for me, of course, is not only the model, but also the controller, all of the views, and not just the ERB HTML views, but the JSON views. So if there aren't any other questions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the JSON views. And I'm going to show you sort of how we would remove the HTML support from our application. Because if we want our application simply to be an API, and again, this is something that not everyone's going to do on their project. So today's lecture applies most to people that are planning on using a front-end framework in their application, or also just people who are generally interested in how APIs work. It's a very big part of, if you're going to be working in the web world, knowing how APIs work and how to build them is a big part about being a full-stack web developer. So let's look at restaurants to begin with. We have a restaurant controller. This was pre-built for us. It has all of our 7 RESTful routes, a route for index and show and new and edit. And it has a set of routes that take us to these various actions. And above each one of the actions, it sort of speaks to the route that would trigger that action. We don't want to trigger any more on /restaurants. We only want to respond to /restaurants.json. Same thing goes for our show action. We don't want to trigger on a get request to /restaurant/SomeID. We only want to trigger on the JSON. So really, I could go ahead and remove the comments that mention just HTML endpoints. So I quickly remove those. The other thing that can be removed is the new and the edit endpoints. Those are the endpoints that take us to forms. So for example, we're working with dishes now. So if I go to restaurants we're working with restaurants now. So if I go to restaurants/new, there's a form. If I go to a particular restaurant and I edit it at /restaurants1/edit, I also get a form. When we're working in an API world, we don't have forms anymore. Forms are for actual users that are filling out data, and they give us the ability to post that data back to the website. But when we're working in an API-based world, we don't need forms anymore, right? There's no human to fill out the form. The form data, when creating new or editing existing restaurants, is going to be sent to us as a JSON payload in our API. So we can actually remove the new and the edit actions. Okay, that's all well and great. I can remove them here, but the problem is that the routes still exist. And so just removing them didn't actually remove them from my application. I have to go and remove the routes from my application. And so we know that the routing system exists in our routing files. Specifically in the config folder, we have the routes.rb. Here are the various resource-based routes. So these are the commands that create our 7 RESTful routes for us. My API, I only want to expose dishes, ingredients, and restaurants. The idea of measurements and measured ingredients, I'm going to sort of remove that from my app, and I'm going to embed some of that data into my dishes endpoint. So I'm going to remove the first 2 of those resources, and then I'm going to put a constraint here. I'm going to say constraints, and it's going to be a block with a do and an end. And I need to spell constraints correctly as well. And the type of constraint I'm going to put on it is a format constraint. I only want to accept routing requests that are of the JSON variety. And how I'm going to do that is I can, on this constraint, I can take a look at the request object that Rails is dealing with. And how I'm going to do that is with a Lambda function. Now, a Lambda function is something that we haven't quite looked at yet in the context of Ruby, but it will be familiar to you if you think over to the JavaScript world and you think about the fat arrow syntax for defining functions. The Lambda syntax came to Ruby a little bit before JavaScript got its fat arrows, but it looks similar, but it is sort of confusingly similar, right? It's not quite the same. So instead of using a fat arrow with the equal sign, we set up an arrow with the minus sign. Then inside of parentheses, we define the argument for, or sorry, the parameter for our Lambda, what this anonymous function is going to take in, which is, I'm going to call it request. I could just call it the letter R if I wanted to here as well. Constraints always pass a request in, and then I'm just calling that request the word request. And then inside of curly braces is the body of this anonymous function, where I'm going to say the constraint here is that the request format is equal to JSON only. And so now when HTTP requests come into our Rails application, the first thing before we actually dole out the resources is we check the format. If the format isn't JSON, we're just going to return a 404. And because I messed with the routes, I'm going to restart the server. So I'll go over to my server running here and Control C and run Rails S again. That started back up. I go back over here. Here's that endpoint that was previously working for edit. No route matches. I should be able to go to /restaurant/JSON, but /restaurants on its own, which previously loaded up the index action and the index view, that says a routing error has occurred. This is the message that would appear in development mode. In production mode, we would just straight up get a 404. And a 404 is actually what's being returned here. If we were to look into our dev tools under the network tab and reload this page, you can see, might be a little bit hard for you to read, but here the status of the request is 404 down below here. So with those routing constraints in place, that means we could go to the view folder, so the app views folder, head over to restaurants, and we could just straight up remove all of the ERB files. So I've clicked on the first of them, and then I'm going to hold down Control, and I'm going to click all the other ERBs, and then I'm going to hit the delete key, and I'm going to delete those. And so what I'm left with in that views folder is just 3 files that all have the double file extension .json.jbuilder. And so just like when we're creating HTML in Rails, we have .html.erb, and it's ERB that generates the HTML. In this case, we have .json.jbuilder, and it's the JBuilder gem that is part of Rails that is going to build up our responses. Before I look into those, I want to dig in a little bit deeper into how we would debug and test this API as we're working with it. Working with the API directly from a browser works to a certain extent, but it only really works for GET requests. Browsers are limited in the HTTP verbs that they can use, right? A browser can get, and then by way of a form, a browser can post. But there are other verbs, and here we have a list of the routes that are available in our resource. When we are creating new dishes, the create action of the dishes controller, a post request And in the API mode, this is going to be a post of a JSON payload representing a dish, or if we went down to restaurant, let's stick with restaurant because that's what we've been working with. Restaurants. So to get to the create endpoint, we're going to post some JSON to /restaurants, but there are other verbs, right? Like if I want to do an update of an existing restaurant by ID, I'm going to use the patch verb. And if I want to delete an existing restaurant, I'm going to use the HTTP delete verb. And we cannot use those verbs from the browser. Rails operates when we're in web mode. It uses JavaScript to actually make those calls because JavaScript can use the full set of verbs, but the browser itself, just in HTML mode, can't. So it's not the ideal platform to be testing out an API. What I tend to use for testing APIs is an application called Postman, and it is it says the collaborative platform for API development. Originally, Postman was a plugin, like a plugin for a browser. It is now a downloadable app. So it is something that we're going to be using in class today. It's a commercial product, but the free version works really nicely. There is an open source version of Postman called Postwoman that runs within the browser. I cannot use it for our demonstrations today, specifically because it cannot hit localhost. It is an online tool, so it could go to existing online APIs and make requests to them, but in a development environment, it can't hit localhost. There's another tool, this one here, that I just discovered called Insomnia, and it's at the insomnia.rest endpoint. And it looks like another interesting way of dealing with testing APIs, but I don't have any experience with it yet. The thing that I really liked about it is I've started to experiment with another style of API beyond REST called GraphQL, and it supports both HTTP and GraphQL endpoints. And so I'm going to look a little bit more into this free and open source tool, but I don't have any experience with this Insomnia just yet. So I do have Postman installed on this computer, and so I'm going to run it. And it's going to operate very similar to a browser, except the idea here is that we're sort of operating solely in API mode. So I put my endpoint in right here. I'm going to say go to the restaurant endpoint. Initially, I'll just do the now defunct /restaurant. So this is the one that won't work anymore because it's just /restaurant without the .json. But I'm going to ask Postman to do a GET request. Here you can see I can specify which verb to use, but I'm going to use a GET request. And I'm going to send this request to /restaurant, and we'll see what happens. Click send. Status is shown right here. You can see the status is 404, not found, which is expected. That route doesn't exist anymore. And then in the sort of response, you can see the routing error that we saw in the browser. If I go to the correct endpoint now, .json, and I click send. Oops, why did you not work? Well, I guess I should preview this. Oh, because I'm missing the letter S. So that wasn't even a fair, okay, so /restaurants was the 404, but /restaurants.json. If I go back to pretty view, you can see the returned JSON. So this is going to be the tool we use for testing out our endpoints, and it's going to allow us not only to test out GET requests, but to do other things. So even before I enhance the existing API, let's look at some of those other things. when we scaffolded up a Rails application, we had the ability from the browser to not only list existing restaurants, but also create new restaurants, edit existing restaurants, and delete existing restaurants. We can now do all of that as an API. So to post to the /restaurants.json endpoint is to create a new, again here, let me just make sure we know why. If I go to /rails/info in my browser here and I pull up the restaurants endpoint, to create, we look under the controller action here. To get to the create action of our controller, it's a post request to /endpoint/ what format we're working with. In our case, it's .json. So that is, we're going to test that out from Postman. We're then also going to test out updating. So to get to the update action of the controller, we're going to send a patch request to /restaurants/someprimarykey.json, and then to destroy or delete a record, we're going to go to restaurants/someid, and we're going to send a delete verb there. So let's do that. Right now, when we did the GET request, we have, if I scroll down to the bottom here, we have 10 different restaurants. The last one has a primary key of 10, and it's called Smokestack Burger. I'm going to set up a post request to create a new restaurant, and I have to set up a few things. One, I have to set up some HTTP headers. So I go into this header section, and I've added a header, and I just typed this in. So when I first came in here, this area was empty. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, yeah, I want a new key value pair as a header. There's 9 that are already set up. Those are just the defaults that come with all requests that Postman sends out. And I'm going to say, this is the content type header, and the type of content that I am sending and receiving is going to be application/JSON. And so that is step 1. And then the body of my post request is going to be JSON. And the way that Rails is expecting it is we have one object wrapping at the outermost level, which has the key restaurant. And remember, in JSON, our keys are always string keys, and they're always double quoted string keys. So you don't want to accidentally use single quotes, or you don't want to accidentally not use quotes at all. If you forgot to use quotes, Postman's smart enough to warn you about that. You can see this little thing that says bad string. A bad string, don't do it. So I'm setting up a restaurant, and then I have an object here that describes the 2 required things to create a restaurant, which is the name of the restaurant. We're setting up Glutton Noodle House, and the description is Wally Glutton makes tasty noodles. And that's it. That's all I need to do to set up this API request, a post request to my restaurants JSON endpoint. I send in the body payload the JSON describing the restaurant. I make sure in the headers that I've set up my content type to be application JSON. I send that in. Oh, and all of that to see a huge error. Oh yeah, I was supposed to be expecting this. Invalid authenticity token. Rails does all sorts of hack protection for us, and specifically when working with data being sent to our website, it protects against a particular flavor of attack called a cross-site request forgery attack. Cross-site request forgery. CSRF. CRF is an attack that forces an end user to execute unwanted actions on a web application in which they're currently authenticated, meaning like if you are already logged into a website, another site or maybe a payload on that existing site can use the fact that you're already authenticated to have you sort of behind the scenes, have your browser do things that the attacker wants you to do, but that you don't know are actually happening. So Rails includes provisions to prevent that, but we have to turn those off because we're no longer operating in web mode. We're operating now in API mode. And so I'm going to show us how to disable that. That was the step that I forgot. And so that is in my controllers. I'm going to go to the application controller. So remember, the application controller is the thing that all controllers inherit from. They all inherit. Restaurant controller, everything inherits from application controller. Application controller in turn inherits from action controller base, which is where we get all of our controller logic. But we can also put things into the application controller class and have it inherited by all of our other classes. And here I'm just going to say protect from forgery with a null session. The default is what we just saw in Postman. The default is that an error is thrown, an exception gets thrown specific, this invalid authenticity token. So I need to turn that off because I don't want the authenticity tokens to be tested. Those are a thing that we need to worry about in web mode, but not in API mode. So I'm going to go back to my command line. I'm going to Control-C on my server and run it again. And now my CR cross-site CSRF forgery is now disabled. So disable the web-based cross-site request forgery protection. I'm gonna cross my fingers, head back over to Postman and try posting this JSON payload one more time. Sending that. What did I get as a result? Look at that. I got back an object telling me that an object has been created. It has a primary key of 11. It has the name and the description that I submitted, created at and updated at timestamps, and a URL to the permalink for that particular restaurant's JSON representation. And if I go back to the GET request for all restaurants and rerun that, we can see at the very bottom there is Glutton Noodle House added to our list. So you can see Postman is sort of like a tabbed browser. It has all these different tabs for the different API endpoints that I want to set up. So that is creating, how to test creation by way of with Postman. What if I want to update a record? So if we remember from our routes here, to get to the update action, it's a patch request to /restaurants/ some existing ID. So if we wanted to update the Glutton Noodle House, it has an ID of 11. And so I happen to have a tab here where I have put into the URL localhost 3000 /restaurant /11.json. If I did a GET request to that, I would see the Glutton Noodle House data, but I'm going to do a patch request. That'll trigger update. In my headers, I've specified content type with a capital C and T and a dash between them as application JSON. And then in my body, as my payload, I have a similar JSON structure, similar to what we sent when we created a post. And now I'm saying, no, that actually shouldn't be the Glutton Noodle House. It should be Santa Lucia Pizza with this description. And I could put one or the other, right? Because I already have an existing restaurant. I could just update the description. In fact, let's show you that. So let's say Glutton noodles are the bomb. And if I send that, and I go back here and I reload all of my restaurants, you can see the description has been updated. And if I go back to patch here and I go back to what I had before with a name and a description, changing the restaurant to Santa Lucia Pizza and Delicious Za, send that back over here. Glutton Noodle House is no more. Santa Lucia Pizza is in the house. So all of this is happening inside of Rails, right? Like this is happening inside of our restaurants table. If we were to look at the server running here, we would see that post request coming in. Oh, sorry, the patch request coming in. We would see that it's running the update action. We would see the parameters being that payload that we sent in. We would see that our CSRF token authenticity can't be verified because we've disabled that. And then we would see the actual update statement affecting our database. And then the last thing that I want to demo is, at least in Postman, is the delete here. If we want to completely remove that restaurant that we just added, we can do a delete request. So I pick delete from the link here. I go to the URL that is the endpoint for this particular resource, which is primary key 11 of the restaurants. I don't need to set any headers because there is no body payload. I'm not sending any JSON. I'm also not expecting any response here. There shouldn't be anything that comes back. I'm just expecting a success message in terms of the status code that's being returned. And so if we saw on, on our patch, the status code for the patch was a 200, right? That's the standard, like everything is operational in a web world, right? That's the everything is happy status code. But in fact, all of the 200s indicate a positive response, a successful response. So we're going to see a different flavor of 200 when we do this delete request. So I'm going to send this off, a delete request to delete that new restaurant. I got nothing back in terms of body results, but I did get a status code of 204, which means success, but no content. So the thing that you just fired off worked, but there's nothing to send back to you because we just deleted something. So there's no need to actually specify anything else in the response payload. Okay, so that is a high-level overview of how Postman works for testing API endpoints, and also a high-level overview of the JSON API that is built for you for free when you do scaffolding in Rails. Before I proceed, does anyone have any questions about any of that or anything that I've mentioned so far? If you do, hop yourself into the WebEx chat or the Discord and drop a question in. What if you want to have the API but also want to be able to add new recipes? That's a very good question. And I imagine you want to be able to add new recipes that are not by way of the seed script. The easiest thing to do there is to add active admin into your website so that you could have an administrative dashboard that you could still hit with your web browser and the API from the front end. You might even want to make the API like a read-only API. You might want to make the API only respond to GET requests so that you could respond to like an index or a show, but not have it, because I haven't even talked about authentication on these APIs yet. So currently our API is completely wide open in terms of authentication. Anyone hitting it can create and update and delete. And so it might even be safer just to only allow API endpoints for index and show and keep the rest of the CRUD in a active admin point of view. And then another question here, are we allowed to create the API using the base endpoints without the JSON? I'm not using the scaffolding using the example, so it doesn't have to act. Yeah, exactly. So that's no problem at all. If you create your own style of routes for your API, you don't have to include the .json in there. That is just a convention that Rails offers that is really mainly used when you are offering endpoints that both respond to JSON and HTML. It's a way of differentiating between the two. So yeah, you can definitely create an API and have it respond with JSON, but you don't have to, in your route, include the .json in there. That's definitely a possibility. Any other questions about APIs? What I'm going to do next is I'm going to, we'll take a little bit of a break, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to show us how we can modify some of the responses for these endpoints. And then we have another comment here. Yeah, I thought we could do auth tokens, but I think it should be fine using admin then. Yeah, so you could do either, right? So a lot of APIs, commercial APIs or open APIs, do use token-based authentication, usually JSON web tokens or JWTs. That's going to go outside the scope of what we're covering today. But yeah, you could use those for auth, or you could just keep your API read-only, only accepting like GET requests to the index and the show endpoints, and then use active admin for everything else in terms of yeah, all the other CRUD actions being behind a username and password. So I'm going to pause my recording of this video. Okay, so let's look at a new tab here. I'm going to go to, let's say like restaurants 1, and just get that single restaurant. So this is what is being returned when we fetch a single restaurant. We're getting the name and the description. We know from our database model that there's a one-to-many association between restaurants and dishes. And so let's make the assumption that that there's a separate team working on the front end of our website. They're using React, and they're going to be fetching this data. And one of the bits of information that they always want with along with restaurant data is the names of the dishes that restaurant makes. So they always want that included with the payload of the restaurant description. Right now, there's no way for them to request that data, right? There's really no way to understand that relationship of which dishes belong to which restaurants, other than doing something ridiculous like requesting a list of all of the dishes and then looking to see which ones have a foreign key restaurant ID of 1 to associate it with this one here. So let's make this API a little bit more discoverable and make it so that we can provide a way to learn more about the dishes that each restaurant makes. And so I'm going to go to the code here. I'm going to close down the tabs that I have open. Right now I am working with the restaurants controller, and we're really just working with the data that's being returned at the show and the index endpoints. The show is just going to be the data for a single JSON representation of a restaurant, and the index is like, you know, multiple versions of that for each of the restaurants in our system. For both the show and the index, if we look in the restaurants view folder, we can see that there is an index.json.jbuilder. That is what is going to be automatically rendered. So if I go underneath here, I can say after action, auto magically renders the index.json.jbuilder. And after the show, it automatically renders the show.json.jbuilder. in the index.json.jbuilder, we're going to have access to an @restaurants variable. So just like with our ERB views, the JBuilder views get access to the instance variables that are created here. The JBuilder view will get access to the @restaurant array. Now in our show action, it looks like nothing's actually being done here. But if we look up at the top here, there's something called the before action. And it says before action, set restaurant. And then this is only valid for show. Edit's not a thing anymore. So it's only valid for show, update, and destroy. And what is set restaurant? Well, it's a little helper down here, which goes and creates an @restaurant variable by taking the ID that's coming from the URL and using it to find the restaurant in question. So this here is actually what is being done in the show. It's just the code's been sort of refactored so that that same set restaurant is going to happen for all of the member links, all of the links that include an ID inside of them. And so for this, the JBuilder view, in this case the show view, will get access to the this one up here needs a plural and this one is singular, @restaurant object. And that's from the set restaurant. Okay, so knowing that, we can look at these two different JBuilder views. It's quite simple, and that's because we're making use of a partial. So just like we have partials in our HTML ERB views, we also have them in the context of JBuilder. You can see a partial is being mentioned in each one of these. And the way to read this is, in JBuilder, we get a special variable called JSON, and that's a builder, and it's going to build JSON for us. In our case, what it's doing here, it's the JSON object. We're going to give it an array, and that array is our restaurants object, at least for the index it is. And then for each object in that object, we're going to create JSON using this partial, this restaurant/restaurant partial, which is found in the same folder. And then we just say as restaurant. And so inside of that partial, each object inside of this collection is going to be known as restaurant. In the show, we're also going to render a JSON partial, the same partial, and we're going to pass it the restaurant object that we have available to us. So in the index, we're looping over the @restaurants collection, and in the partial, we're calling each restaurant. There's going to be a variable called restaurant. And with show, we're rendering this partial, and we're going to make a restaurant variable available, and it's going to be from our @restaurant. So the data is coming from the controllers, the @restaurants, or the @restaurant coming from here, and the partial is being rendered either once per object or once for that particular. And so now let's look at that partial. Just like our HTML partials, it starts with an underscore. The assumption is that we have access to a restaurant variable that's coming to us by way of the collection or the object. We're using our special JSON variable, and here we're saying extract from this object the ID, name, description, created at, and updated at, and make those available in our JSON structure. And then also create a new property of this JSON called URL that is, and there's a little helper here, restaurant URL. So if you think back to like link to, for example, in views, there were ways of like working with Rails's routing system to have it build routes for us. In JSON, when we want to build a restaurant URL, we just use the restaurant URL method, pass in the restaurant we want the URL to, and ask it for the JSON format. Yes, let's look at the return JSON here in reference to what is being defined up above. All right. Can I make this bigger here somehow? Yeah, so this ID becomes down below this ID with its value. The fact that we're asking to extract the name means we get the name out. The fact that we're asking for the description means we get this description out. Created at, updated at, those are down below here. And URL is this URL here. So if I removed line 2, this one here, and saved it, and we went back to this request, you can see the URL property of my JSON object goes away. If I remove any one of these extract commands, so say I only want to return the created at but not the updated at, I can remove it from the extract command, and when I rerun, you can see only created at is returned there, not updated at. Okay, so I'll put those back into place. Okay, so I said what the front-end team, our fictional front-end team, wants as part of this URL, as part of this JSON data is also the dishes. So I'm going to say JSON.dishes. That's going to give me a new section in my JSON document. I'm going to pass to that. I'm going to go to my restaurant object, restaurant dot, and remember there's a one-to-many association here, so I can go and use active record associations to get to the dishes. Then I'm going to say do dish. And what this will do is it'll loop through my dishes, pulling them from the restaurant that we're working with, dishes association. And then for each one of them, it'll temporarily call it dish. And we can build a nested JSON structure where we return the dish. Well, let's just start with like the dish URL. So I'll say URL, dish, URL, dish, format is JSON. So just like up here when we wanted to provide the restaurant URL, which I might put at the bottom. Yeah. So over here, the return JSON will have the ID, name, description, our timestamps. It's going to have an array of the dishes that are associated with the restaurant, providing a URL to each one of them. And then it will also return the URL to this particular restaurant in question. So if I go to Postman here and I re-request the data, see if I can get this side by side here. Yeah. You can see here when I requested that data, here is the ID, name, description, the timestamps. There are the dishes. This restaurant has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dishes associated with it, and each one has a URL. And so programmatically, the front-end team would be able to then follow each one of these URLs to get information about each one of the dishes. So let's say I deploy that, put it out on the API, the front-end team starts working away with it, that's fine. And then they tell me this is a pain. They actually want on every page that displays a restaurant, they want at minimum the name of the restaurant. So every time right now what they're having to do is they're having to load up the JSON data for a restaurant, and then they're having to follow n URLs in their JavaScript code to pull up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or more. Maybe some restaurants have hundreds of dishes. In a loop, they're hitting these endpoint after endpoint after endpoint. They want more. They're like, every time we display a restaurant, we always somehow expose or display the dishes of that restaurant by name. Can you give those to me as well? And so it's okay, let's give a little bit more information about these dishes. I'll give the dish ID and the dish name. So with the JSON builder, I'm saying what keys I want in my JSON structure, and then I'm giving them data from this dish object that we're looping over. And if I resubmit my request here, send. Now we can see for golden spoon, each of the dishes their names, and still a link to discover more about the dish. And what we're going to do in a moment is we're going to enhance this dishes endpoint so that the dishes also show the various ingredients. And so that is really all I wanted to do to enhance this particular endpoint, the restaurant endpoint, so that it would show the dishes with their various names. Let us now move over to the dishes views. Here, I haven't cleaned up the dishes controller yet, and I'm going to leave that. Cleaned up meaning like removed all the HTML stuff. So it still supports some of the HTML actions. Those can be removed. Inside of the dishes folder, we still have the ERB code. Those can be removed. We'll just temporarily just move on to working directly with the dishes. And I'm going to open up the dish JBuilder partial. It's pretty simple right now. If I visit a particular dish by GET request, all I learn about that dish is the dish's name and the ID the ID of the restaurant that dish is associated with. Restaurant ID. Yeah, so I want to turn that restaurant ID into the actual name of the restaurant and make it discoverable so that you could follow a link to the restaurant. And I also want to expose the ingredients, those measured ingredients with this as well. So I'm going to go in here. Oh, and images, right? There's images associated with these dishes. I have to expose their active storage URLs as well. And so that's the remaining work that we want to do today. We want to expose the associated restaurant name and URL. We want to expose the dishes measured ingredients, and expose the, that's it. Yeah. Oh yeah, the images. Expose the dish image and a thumbnail of a smaller version of the image. Okay, let's do each one of those in turn. So expose the associated restaurant name. So we know from above and our other work that if we go to our builder and we say dot something, that's a new key that's going to show up in our JSON. So we're going to say dot restaurant. And in this case, what do we want to display for the restaurant? We want to display the ID of the restaurant, going to the, now we're going to use again Rails association because a dish belongs to a restaurant. Remember, if we look at our model, a dish belongs to a restaurant. So a dish.restaurant.id will get us the ID. We're going to get the name, again by way of the association. And we're going to get the discoverable URL by building it. So we're going to say restaurant URL dish.restaurant format JSON. Hop over to Postman, make a request for this dish. We don't need the restaurant ID in here anymore, and so we can remove that. And there we go. I like having this URL at the very bottom for whatever reason. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so there is the associated restaurant. Peking duck is made at the Golden Spoon restaurant. And for more information about the Golden Spoon, API users can follow this URL for more information. So it makes our API discoverable. Okay, so that's great. the front end team is telling me that working with dishes is fine, this is working well, but now they're on a page where whenever they show a dish, they're not only mentioning the restaurant that that dish belongs to and linking back to that restaurant, but they're also showing all of the measured ingredients. They don't need to, at least from the front end point of view, link directly to ingredients themselves, but they want to display an ingredients list here in the API so that they can access those along with their measurements. And so instead of exposing like a measured ingredients key, I'm just going to expose an ingredients key, but it actually is going to be the measured ingredients. And so what I mean by that is in our JSON object that's going to be sent out, we're going to have an ingredients key, but what I'm going to pass to it is the dishes measured ingredients. Remember that a dish has many measured ingredients, and through those measured ingredients we get to ingredients. And then a measured ingredient has an amount, and it also has a measurement. So I will say do here, and because we are looping through a collection, we're gonna call each one of the measured ingredients in turn measured ingredient singular. And I could call that MI if I wanted a shorter name. It's not meaningful, the name itself there. And then so for each of these measured ingredients, I'm going to provide their ID. So that'll be the measured ingredient.id. The name, that'll be the measuring ingredient, but then going to the associated ingredient and getting the name. So I'm doing a lot of traversals here through associations. JSON.amount is going to expose the measured ingredient amount. The measurement, so is it in milliliters, is it in grams, what is it? We're going to go to call that measurement, and we'll go to measured ingredient, and again a measured ingredient, if we look at the models, has 3 foreign keys in it. It belongs to a dish, an ingredient, and a measurement. So I can do dot measurement dot name. Let's see how that's working out from a Postman perspective. For each of our measured ingredients, we should see an array called ingredients with an ID, a name, an amount, and a measurement. And some of this data is coming directly from the measured ingredients. Some of it is further chaining into the ingredients table or into the measurement table or measurements table. And there we are, Peking duck. The ingredients, the secret ingredients of the Peking duck recipe is 33 milliliters of mustard seed, 83 milliliters of onion, 80 milliliters of hummus, 6 liters of soy. That's a lot of soy. I don't know what besan is, but 70 grams of that, and 37 grams of brie cheese. Sounds delicious. So here we are, we now have that information made. If I further wanted to expose the ingredient endpoint and make this ingredient discoverable, I could do so with a URL. Going to make an ingredient URL from my measured ingredients ingredient, and the format is going to be JSON. Oh, I did something wrong there. Measured ingredient singular. And there we are, a discoverable endpoint for our dish that includes the restaurant data and a list of measured ingredients that we could display on our website. And then the last thing is that these dishes do have URLs for their active storage images associated with them. And so if you remember way back at the start of this lecture, when I was going over the seed script, when we were creating a dish, we were finding an image for that dish from Unsplash and attaching it using active storage. Now, in the case of what I've set up here, that attachment is done on the file system, but we could have set up active storage to have that data stored on Amazon S3 or in Google Cloud Storage, something like that. The URL associated with it will always look like a local URL, but then Rails might route it to one of those cloud services. But we want to expose those image URLs, and I want to expose two of them. I want to expose the full-sized image, and then I also want to expose what's called a variant of that image, which is like a smaller version, and active storage can create those variants for us. And so that's the final thing that I want to expose here, which is the dish image. And so I'm going to say JSON.image URL. And then active storage gives us a special helper called URL4. And we just go to our dish variable. That's the variable that we've been working with all along. Dish, dish, dish. And we're just going to go to its .image property because that's what our active storage attachment is called. Has one attached, and I called it an image. And so if I had said has one attached Bob, it would say, you know, I would say .bob in my dish builder here, but here I'm saying .image. Save that, hop over to Postman, scroll down to the bottom, and you can see we've got a URL here. I can, let's see, I can go and copy and paste that URL right into a browser. And there's my picture of a duck. When I pulled in these images, I pulled them in as 600 by 600. I did that by way of the Unsplash API. Here you can see I was asking or requesting for 600 by 600, but the front end team has asked that I expose a URL that they can use in their React components. Not only a 600 by 600 one, but they also wanted a small thumbnail, a 200 by 200 thumbnail of the image. So that's the last thing I'm going to expose in this API. I'm going to say JSON dot, and I'm going to call the key thumbnail URL. I got to spell that correctly. And then here again, active storage has provided us with a particular, let's see, a particular helper, which is the Rails representation URL. Did I spell that correct? Representation URL. And then how we work with active storage to ask for a variant of a different size is we say dish.image.variant, and then the kind of variant is a resize variant, and I want to resize to 200 by 200. This will resize on the fly, but if I'm expecting that this is going to happen many times, which I think it will, like in my application, the front end team has told me that they're going to use this quite often, I can make this processed so that the very first time that this variant is requested, it'll actually create that image and save it. So it'll create a 200 by 200 version of that image. And for this to work in your WSL, there's one other thing you need to do in your gem file. You need to have image processing uncommented, for active storage variants. And so that's something I uncommented. It was in the gem file already. I just needed to uncomment it. And it makes use of, this image processing, makes use of a Linux command line tool called Image Magic. And so again, to make that work, I had to go to my WSL and do a sudo apt-get install image magic. And that's magic with a K on the end. Image magic with a K. I already have that installed, so I'm not going to run that script, but that's the command line tool that image processing gem uses to actually do the resizing. And that's because if we were to do the resizing in Ruby, it would probably be quite slow compared to a compiled command line tool that is optimized for image resizing. And so with all of that in place, my Rails representational URL, or my Rails representation URL of the dish image variant 200 by 200 processed. Go back to Postman, go back to where I was requesting my dish here. Scroll down to the bottom, and there are the two URLs. You can see there's a little something different between the two of them. For the image URL itself, it is just giving the relative path, and for the thumbnail, it's including the HTTP and the domain name in there. If I wanted the two of them to match, I could I imagine the front-end team knows which domain that they're on, or they can just make a relative request to the existing domain. And so for this command right here, the Rails representational URL command, I can add in only path and set that to true. Not trues, but true. There we are. And back over on Postman, making this request again. And scrolling down, we can see in both cases, it's only the path that is being sent there. We have a image URL key value pair, a thumbnail URL key value pair. And if I take the URL for the thumbnail and I put that into my browser, here was the 600 by 600. I can paste in the 200 by 200 link, and I get a smaller image. And so Rails has indeed used Image Magic to create that variant, saved it to my hard drive, and made it accessible by way of a very long URL, but it's only being used, it's not a human use URL, it's only going to be used by our front-end team in terms of their clients, and so they can now fetch that information when it comes to fetching information about a dish. We are almost out of time. The very last thing that I just need to talk about, which is actually quite important, is when we were working with Rails earlier on, we saw that when we were working with associations, we sometimes got n+1 problems. When we would request a thing, and then when we would, in the view, start looping over an associated thing, we would end up firing off a whole bunch of extra SQL. This is now a problem in our application. If we look at what happens when we do a GET request to just /restaurants. So that's getting all of our restaurants. Oh, .json. For every restaurant, we're also looping over dishes. The problem that that causes is we fetch all the restaurants, and then as we are rendering our JSON, we're making multiple calls to select dishes. Not very optimal, right? We need to deal with that in terms of an n+1 issue. And so I'm going to go to my restaurant controller. Here it is right here. And I'm going to add dot includes dishes. I can go back to Postman. I can make another request you can see here when we had the n+1 problem in place, it took 36 milliseconds to respond to that request. Here's the new request. It's only 2 hits to the database rather than n+1 hits. And, well, it went up. It primarily, you can't necessarily measure efficiency because my computer is doing many other things at the same time, including screen sharing and recording, and so the time it takes to do things is not actually constant. But we do see that we've hit the database far fewer times. We do have a similar problem, but even worse on the restaurant side of things. Or sorry, on the dishes side of things. And so if we were to get every one of our dishes, look at all the requests firing off in the back end there. It took a full 6 seconds to deal with that request, and pages of requests happening. And that's because when we were building up this dishes JSON builder, we're going to a lot of nested things. We're going to the restaurant, we're going to our measured ingredients. From the measured ingredients, we're going to ingredients. From the measured ingredients, we're going to measurements. We're going to active storage. We're doing so many things. I'm almost out of time, but here, let me just quickly show you how we would deal with this problem. In the dishes controller, when we're fetching the dishes, we need to fetch it with a few things. I'm going to chain them together. One of them is going to be an includes, like we used with restaurants. The other is active storage, gives us a special with attached image that'll eager load the images. The includes, well, we need to, we said, include the restaurant, because that is something that we're fetching for each dish. But we also need to include measure ingredients, but not just measure ingredients, but their nested ingredients and their nested measurements. And so we have to say something like this. We're going to put a comma here, going to go to the new line, and we're going to say we need measured ingredients, but not just measured ingredients. We need their associated ingredient and their associated measurement. Save that up. Let's go back to Postman. Let's send that off. Instead of 6 seconds, it took 200 milliseconds. These are not SQL requests. That's disk storage. That's active record kicking in. But if we scroll up, we'll see that we have far fewer. Instead of pages and pages of requests, we have a few requests going in to the backend. So that's the very last of what I wanted to show you today. We could even slim down these controllers even more by removing anything that mentions responding to HTML format, but that I will leave for another day. There is a branch in the repo that mentions the JBuilder being finished. You can look at that branch and you can see that I've actually trimmed down all those controllers in that way.